I'm good to go. All right. If everyone's ready. Addit 98 resolved the United States should remove nearly all of its military presence in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. Our first contention concerns U.S. counter-terror efforts in Iraq. Costa 19 reports that at the height of its power in 2014, ISIS controlled a territory of 41,000 square miles in Iraq and Syria. However, the Wilson Center 19 finds that Iraqi and U.S. forces have reclaimed most ISIS territory in the country, cutting terrorism in 2018 compared to 2017 by 75% in Iraq. And Haltiwanger 20 reports that now ISIS no longer controls any large territory across Iraq. U.S. forces are crucial to maintain this web. Kelson 20 reports that there are currently 5,200 U.S. troops in Iraq, which Gibson Neff 20 finds advise and accompany local Iraqi counter-terror forces to fight the remaining 20,000 ISIS fighters in the region. Unfortunately, NOAC 20 states that if the United States were to withdraw its troops from Iraq, it would result in a resurgence of the Islamic State. Hyman 18 finds that the 2011 withdrawal of U.S. troops left a power vacuum in Iraq, which was filled again by ISIS, which gained control of vast swaths of territory in Iraq and threatened the Iraqi government. NOAC quantifies that if ISIS were to return to some parts of the country, the humanitarian effect will be devastating, putting people back under ISIS rule, causing 1.8 million to be internally displaced and 6 million to need humanitarian assistance. Furthermore, instability in Iraq would trigger civil conflict, as the ICG-11 explains that the Iraqi government and Iraqi Kurds have disagreed over claims to territory along the Iraqi border between the Kurdish region and the Arab-majority provinces for decades. Fortunately, the United States' enactment of security checkpoints with U.S. military officers along this border has successfully prevented conflict. Unfortunately, Dommins 09 explains that a U.S. withdrawal would end this mediation and resume these territorial disputes, which Briticana 18 quantifies would kill up to 100,000 people. Our second contention concerns foreign investment into Arab states. Santander 20 finds that for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, FDI is rapidly increasing at triple-digit percentages. Indeed, Jones 05 explains that U.S. military creates a security blanket that reduces the risk for businesses, attracting trade and investment. Crane 20 furthers that MNCs invest by following the presence of U.S. troops because it implies strong political relations that could direct economic policy. Overall, Jones quantifies every 10,000 U.S. troops leads to a 1% increase in GDP growth per capita for the host nation. Killing this incentive prevents development. Condi 18 analyzes that FDI makes countries more resilient to shocks because it diversifies economies. For example, Dudley 20 finds that foreign investment is critical for Saudi Arabia to diversify away from oil. There are two impacts. The first is poverty reduction. Because of the increase in local businesses, Nicholas 17 finds that a 1% increase in FDI reduces poverty by 0.47%. The second impact is fueling civil conflict. Barberry of USC adds that because growth decreases radicalism, a 1 standard deviation increase in FDI reduces the probability of civil war by 78%. Any civil war would spill over. As Thine 12, the University of Kentucky explains, that civil wars create refugee crises, decimate investment into regions, and promote terrorism. Worse, Goldstein 19 of the Asia Times finds that it would divide the region on ethnic lines, bringing in larger actors like Russia, China, and Iran, creating a massive regional war. Thus, we negate.
Couple pieces of evidence I would like to see. So first, I want the impact on terrorism. 1.8 million displaced, like however many million need humanitarian aid.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I want the Dong 09 evidence about mediation.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, I want the uniqueness on FDI, like FDI is up right now.
Got it.
Thanks.
Ronick, I can get the first two, just get the third one.
Okay.
all the evidence been sent, or are you still compiling that?
The first two have been sent, Ronick. Are you still looking for the third?
I said, yeah. All of it.
All three have been sent.
Okay, very good. Just confirm when you guys received it and if you need to start your prep time.
I think you're muted.
Sorry. We got them. I'll just read case though. Everyone good? We affirm Contention 1 is drones. Marcus of BBC News in 2019 finds that the US has used armed drones extensively in the Middle East. Columbia in 2012 explained that expanded authority over drone strikes has allowed White House to redefine a terrorist as any age male in a conflict zone. This has led to a massive collateral damage. The Washington Times finds that 90% of individuals killed in drone strikes are civilians. And Zenko Foreign Policy finds that drones on average kill 35 times more civilians than manned aircraft. In Iraq and Syria alone, the DoD reports the United States has conducted 25,000 airstrikes, and Woods 15 finds there has been an additional 12,000 strikes in Afghanistan. Foreign Policy concludes that on average, 8 civilians die in each drone strike, while Shariah of the Journal of Civil and Legal Studies concludes drone strikes have displaced 2.3 million people in Afghanistan. Contention 2 is sending a signal. Bando 18 writes, for the past 4 years, Saudi Arabia has been waging a brutal campaign in Yemen that has gone nowhere and resulted in countless civilian deaths. The US has given Saudi Arabia a blank check, enabling it to continue the killings without any constraints. Bazi 18 explains that Saudi leaders want a clear-cut victory in their regional rivalry with Iran, and they have been emboldened by the Trump administration's unconditional support to stall negotiations. Saudi Arabia and its allies are more likely to accept a peace process if it is clear that the United States won't provide the military assistance required to keep the war apparatus going. The only way to end the war is to utilize American leverage over Saudi Arabia. The Saudis rely on the US alliance to protect them from Iran. Christoph 18 confirms that they buy our weapons because they come with an implicit guarantee that we will bail the Saudis out militarily if they get in trouble with Iran. Saudi Arabia's armed forces can't even defeat a militia in Yemen. So how could they stand up to Iran? That's why we have leverage over Saudi Arabia. We know that the Saudis respond very strongly to US pressure. Niarchos 18 writes that it's no coincidence that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen fell off a cliff when Trump entered office and made protecting Yemen not a priority. We also know that the increase in international pressure on Saudi Arabia following the Khashoggi murder has some positive effects, but the United States need to step out for the Saudis to fully change. Parsi 20 finds that after Trump declared his intentions to pull troops out of the region, de-escalation followed. Parsi quantifies that Saudi Arabia began exercising diplomatic options, leading to an 80% reduction in Saudi-led airstrikes and no Yemeni deaths in the following weeks. However, so long as Riyadh can count on a blank check from Washington, the kingdom has no reason to temper its policy. The impact is saving lives. Constant fighting and airstrikes in Yemen have left civilians caught in the crossfire. The Guardian concludes that the crisis has resulted in at least 100,000 deaths, and Foreign Policy writes that 8 million civilians are facing famine and more than 22 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Contention 3 is authoritarianism. The United States military presence props up authoritarian regimes. The Huffington Post explains authoritarian leaders often capitalize on the base presence to extract benefits or help ensure their own political survival. The Business Insider furthers, the United States often simply gives money to authoritarian leaders that advance U.S. interests. Within the Persian Gulf, Vine of Alternate reports U.S. bases offer legitimacy to authoritarian regimes in 5 states. For example, Vine continues that the Obama administration offered only mild criticism of the Bahraini government when its leaders violently cracked down on pro-democracy protesters. The impact is GDP growth. Authoritarian states tend to provide the impoverished with inefficient public goods that lock citizens into generational poverty. Empirically, a UN report found that in Saudi Arabia, over 2.4 million citizens are living in poverty with inefficient food programs and the lack of coordination from the government. Science Daily finds countries switching to democratic rule experience a 20% increase in GDP, which is why Isaac and I are proud to affirm.
Could I see the card that each drone strike kills 30 civilians or whatever?
Yeah, I'll send you that. Do you want the one that says on average 8 civilians die in each strike, or 35 times more civilians die with drones?
I'll see the 8 per strike.
The 8 per strike. Okay, give me a second.
Have you sent that evidence over?
Yeah, 1 second. About to email it.
Saratoga, when you guys receive it, please confirm, and then if you
Yeah.
want to.
Got it.
Did you already send it?
Yeah, check if you got it.
I haven't gotten it.
Yeah, me neither.
Something wrong with my email. I mean, I'll just wait.
Yes. Okay, I got it now.
Oh yeah, I got it. We'll start prep.
Very good.
Sorry. That was 20 seconds. You ready for crossfire? I think you're muted. I can't.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah. All right, you ready for crossfire?
I'm good.
Do you mind if I have the first question?
No, you can take it.
All right. Is Afghanistan in the Persian Gulf?
No.
Is
Give it.
Pakistan?
What?
Is Pakistan in the Persian Gulf?
No.
Then why is all your evidence about drones about Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Okay, well, let's deal with it one by one. So, in case you're probably asking about 2.3 million people being displaced.
We're also asking about the evidence we just called for, which is also about Pakistan.
Well, let's deal with it one by one, right? You brought up
Okay.
Afghanistan first. So, 2 things we say. We say, 1, we have bases in the region and Persian Gulf that enable us to expand into other nations, such as Afghanistan, which is why we also solve for that. And 2, we just give it as a more general example, right? Like, what happens when all of these drone strikes are conducted? Because we do give evidence specific to the region, right? Like we
Got
tell
it.
you there have been 25,000 strikes in the region. As for the drones evidence, this particular card talks about multiple regions, right? Like this excerpt at the top references Pakistan, but it says that in general, when US conducts drone strikes, civilian deaths are about 8 civilian deaths per each drone strike. So it still applies the region.
How many drone strikes does the US conduct in Saudi Arabia?
Well, in case we tell you 25,000 drone strikes have been
in Saudi Arabia? The US drone strike Saudi Arabia?
in the region we conduct.
Which region? What region are we talking about?
Like the Persian Gulf.
There's 25,000 in the Persian Gulf. Okay, we'll look at that. So you can have a question.
Okay, on FDI, you say FDI is increasing the status quo.
Right.
your evidence talks about what happened in 2017 and like 2018.
Right.
Like,
the evidence is from, I can pull it up. I think the evidence is from 2019 and it says
you don't need to pull it up because the evidence says that between 2017 and 2018, FDI has increased. So like,
Yeah,
where's the correlation with like the presence in troops? Like if it literally happened.
So that's the link evidence we read. We read one from Jones and one from, I forgot who the other author is. Both of them say that investors follow the military presence, which is why investments into these places are increasing. That is the empiric to back up our link evidence, which talks about how investment increases when the U.S. military is in a region. Does that make sense?
Wait, but in 2017, like why was investment, I guess, down before that period of 2017, right? Like our troops were still in the region, right?
Right. So our evidence, we're not saying that investment is never constant. The reason that investment keeps increasing and continually increases is because of U.S. military presence.
Well, that's not true because I read the card you sent and it says that before 2017 and 2018, there was like a massive like decline in FDI. So I'm confused as to how your links can be true. If we were in the region and FDI was dropping beforehand, explain that.
So the comparative is not between the comparative is not 2017 because there were internal reasons why before 2017 investment.
So like alt cause, right? So it's not because of the
military. Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
Without U.S. presence, that decline would have been even lower because investors would not have invested in Saudi Arabia without the security. Does that make sense?
Trying to wiggle out of the debate, but yeah, it's time.
Can we see the 25,000 strikes in the Persian Gulf evidence?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, you should have gotten. You know if you have.
I haven't gotten yet. It's probably coming through. Okay, I got it just now. Okay, yeah, I got it. Yeah. Is everybody ready? Can everybody hear me?
Judge, ready?
Everybody's ready? Okay, cool. Let's start on their first contention. They make this argument that the United States' use of drones in the Middle East is bad. 3 key responses here. First, Certainly 18 finds that in December 2014, the United States conducted 25 strikes in the Persian Gulf. However, unlike my opponent's argument, we only saw 0 to 2 civilians killed. That's because, A, the evidence that they sent us about how 8 civilians are killed per attack studies data sets from 2004 to 2012. Our data is far more recent, analyzing the biggest advancements in terrorism in drone technology, and finds that for every 25 strikes, we see at most 2 civilians killed in the collateral damage. But second, their evidence that quantifies how many civilians are killed per drone strike talks about Pakistan. You can go look at it yourself. At that point, we would say that drone strikes are not bad. The empirics prove that. But second, and most importantly, the biggest use of drone strikes right now is the U.S. using unmanned aerial vehicles, which don't require that the U.S. has military presence in the region. Our analysis here is simple. even if you affirm and withdraw military presence from the region, the United States can still use unmanned aerial vehicles to strike. But third, American drones are far better than any other military weapon used by other countries to combat terrorism. Salayton explains that compared with airstrikes and other military tactics used, drones start comparatively kill less civilians. If the United States decreased its efforts in the Persian Gulf to combat terrorism using things such as drone strikes, other countries would come in to fill the void. For example, Russia. We tell you that empirically, those actions lead to an increase rather than a decrease in civilian casualties. Now, let's go to their second contention about sending a signal. They make this argument that by withdrawing military presence, that will somehow give us leverage to push Saudi Arabia to the negotiating table to end the conflict in Yemen. However, the opposite is the case. Jewel 20 writes that U.S. military presence gives the U.S. leverage to bring the countries to the negotiating table. The logic here is really simple. If we have military presence in the region, we can always tell Saudi Arabia, hey, if you don't comply with what we want, and if you don't engage in negotiations, then we'll withdraw our military presence, thereby giving us leverage, and the threat of taking it away is what gives us that leverage. However, if you vote aft and withdraw military presence, we destroy this leverage and prevent any possibility of bringing them to the negotiating table. We say that empirically, this has worked. But second, Cropsey says that if the U.S. were to pull out, this would both A, embolden the Houthis, who are the Yemeni rebels fighting in the civil war right now, because they feel that if the U.S. is no longer backing Saudi Arabia, they can come in and take over. But B, and more importantly, it would embolden Iran to continue backing the Houthis to fight in the Yemeni civil war. Logically, if Iran and the Houthis feel that no one is opposing them, then they'll feel more emboldened to continue doing what they're doing and continue fighting the war in Yemen. All we do is embolden our allies. We do not stop them by voting out. Finally, on their third contention, all about authoritarianism, they say that the U.S. props up authoritarian regimes. Let's dive deeper into the nuances. The first argument they make is that the U.S. gives them money. Even if we withdraw military presence from the region, there is no reason why we can't continue giving money to these regimes. So if my opponents are correct and the U.S. does prop up these regimes with money, recognize that happens either way. Voting affirmative does not solve this problem. All it does is get rid of the troops. But second, we would say that voting affirmative only makes this worse. Without U.S. presence in the region, A, we lose leverage to force these authoritarian regimes to reform. But second, and more importantly, if these authoritarian regimes continue to oppress their people, there is no way for the U.S. to stop and intervene in the conflict if there's no military presence. The analysis here is really simple. Either way, these authoritarian regimes are going to be authoritarian. At best, you vote for us to ensure that the U.S. can stop it if that ever turns into something bad and harm on the people. Thus, vote nay.
We're going to run prep right now. Okay, that was a minute 45.
Okay. Just going to be responding to what he said in rebuttal, then on to our case. Is anybody not ready? Thumbs up. Okay, thank you guys. Start on our first contention about drones. The first piece of evidence that they read is that there were only 25 strikes. First off, this is empirically not true. We tell you there were 25,000 strikes. But secondly, per our analysis, the government could always be lying about how many random terrorists they're killing. But we tell you straight from the Department of Defense that 25,000 strikes existed. Then they say that it only kills 0 to 2 civilians. But our McCleary evidence explains that obviously they're not killing them civilians because they redefined what a civilian and a terrorist is. To now every male person who is in these regions is considered a terrorist. So obviously we're killing less civilians because we're killing civilians who we call terrorists. But moreover, then they say our evidence about Pakistan. It doesn't matter. The analysis is true that the drone strikes are killing 10 people every single time they go out. Then they say Russia is going to fill in. But realize Russia has no incentive to fill in in the first place because they are allies with the people that we are bombing, for example, Iran. Then they say that the drones are not manned by any people. They read some definition about UAVs, but realize that this doesn't actually account for our analysis because even if they're unmanned definitionally, there are still people controlling them at the military bases. And if the military base doesn't exist and we remove all of our armed forces from the military base, then there's literally no way to conduct these drones. Look up the definition. Then they say drones kill less people, but they don't provide a warrant. We tell you because they define everyone as a terrorist. They kill 35 more civilian deaths, which is the most important impact. With that, let's go on our second contention about the Saudi Arabian relation in Yemen. The first thing that they tell you is that U.S. is really important to resolve this crisis because we use leverage to negotiate the battle. But two things. First off, we're literally not doing that. Millions of people are on the brink of death right now, and the United States hasn't leveraged anything. They're all about to die. But secondly, they say that we can use our arms and our military as a threat. But the threat doesn't come to life if we don't actually change anything. The way that we actually change leverage is by removing our military presence and threatening the nation right now. Then they say two more things. The first is that it's going to embolden the Houthis. But the Houthis literally want peace. They called on Saudi Arabia to stop doing the airstrikes. But because they never ended, the Houthis had to retaliate. Then they say that Iran backs the Houthis. Two things. First off, Iran literally only joined the crisis because it became a US-led coalition in the region, and they don't want and they don't want Western imperialists taking over their region. But secondly, the Houthis only want peace. Even if Iran pushes for war again and again, the Houthis just want their land in the region. That's why they rebelled in the first place. Then they read two reasons for leverage. I've already responded to that on our third contention. With that, let's go on their case. Start at the top about terrorism. Shigman explains that even if you stop one terrorist group right now, because they're very decentralized, they end up splintering into smaller terrorist groups. And Clark explains that these splinter groups are far worse for the region because there's no way to actually control them. That's why foreign policy explains that rather than the United States military going into the region, the United States is letting allies take a change, and they're letting them to fight these terrorists. This is important for two reasons. First off, the anti-Western sentiment that drives terrorists in the first place goes away. But secondly, Michaels in 2016 explains that they're a lot better at it because he furthers that Iraq was able to decrease ISIS's territory by 45% in the region alone without U.S. support. In fact, Zanko explains that if you look at the United States efforts, terrorism has only increased by 4,000% globally. Then they read some argument about the Kurdish territory, but realize that nations are going to oppress the Kurdish people no matter what. But Zenit explains that the Kurdish forces are literally working with the Iraq prime minister now to defend them anyways, so there's no threat on the terrorists if the US military leaves. With that, let's go on their second contention about foreign investment. First off, CNBC in 2019 explains that due to the Jamal Khashoggi killing and the Yemen war, FDI into the region has fallen proportionately, and that never goes away. But you can look at their evidence to disprove this link because it literally gives alternative reasons for why the FDI is going into the region that's not military presence. Moreover, if you go to both of their impacts, they don't diversify oil. Gaffney explains that the United States would never let them diversify oil because they're so dependent on the United States. And on their impact about war, rebel groups don't care about the FDI. They care about their goals. That's why we're very proud to affirm. You ready for cross?
Yeah.
And I think the evidence that Iraq has, without U.S., whichever part says without U.S. help, like without Iraq is in counterterror efforts without U.S. help.
Yeah, just let me know when you get it. Here, I'm gonna get water while you wait.
I still haven't gotten. Did you? I guess we'll just keep waiting. But maybe my Wi-Fi.
I haven't seen it yet either.
If you guys sent it, we can just start cross and then hopefully it comes through during cross. Do you want to do that?
I'll just keep on checking it. Like, I think it just had bad connection, so I'll send it again. Do you want to like wait? Because it'll only take 5 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Doesn't make any sense. You did. Thank you.
Okay, I sent it. He was struggling.
Thank you, guys. Okay. You ready for cross? You can have the first question.
All right. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So on your second contention, you say that the Houthis want peace. Who started the Yemen conflict?
Well, the Houthis started the Yemen conflict because they were rebels in the region who were stripped of all of their autonomy and all of their land.
Got it. You can take a question.
Okay. On your case about terrorism, just because ISIS has fallen down in the year 2019, haven't they fallen down before and just recovered the next year?
No, the only times we've seen recovery in the last decade are times such as 2011 when the U.S. pulled out.
You know, like, for example, terrorism fell in 2018, and then in 2019, they saw a much bigger grasp of land. Like, to start off 2020, they even took more land than Iraq.
It's still on an overall downward trend. Like, I agree, sure, there's maybe some sort of like up-down movement, but overall, it's on a downward trend when the U.S. has presence. On the other hand,
what evidence?
The U.S. pulls out. Sorry,
what evidence do you read that explains that on a general trend, looking at the past 10 years or so, we've seen a drop in terrorism?
I mean, that's our analysis based on the warrants we read for why counter-terror operations are good. The one piece of evidence we read.
Yeah, that's
the rest of the evidence talks about the other years too. If you want to look through it, you can just click the URL. Can I take a question though?
Yeah.
So, is the U.S. attempting to exact its leverage to stop the conflict in Yemen right now?
We would say no.
Okay. So, if insofar as the U.S. is not doing it right now, why did they suddenly have a huge paradigm shift and then start doing it in your world?
Our argument is not that the United States is going to be out there fighting for peace in the region.
We understand. That's not my question.
Okay. Well, I don't think that the United States would ever go out for peace. Our argument is that Saudi Arabia, according to the Baazi evidence, would look holistically at the war, and without the U.S. support, they can't sufficiently sustain it in the long term. So they would look towards peace.
So they believe that right now the war is sustainable in the long term.
No, they just think that with the United States backing, they have a better chance.
They don't believe it's stable. Why does it continue now, or why does the U.S. not exact its leverage now?
Well, if you look at the general trend of Saudi Arabia in the foreign relations, when the United States troops pulls out, according to the Parsi evidence, we've seen a strict drop in strikes in all of these other conflict regions because they don't have the confidence from the United States and the U.S. security.
When did the U.S. pull out its troops?
We've had like small pullouts every once in a while. That's what it analyzes.
Yeah,
It's
so when was
10,000 troops from the region. That'll analyze that.
when?
I don't know. Call for Parsi. I'm sure he gives a few examples.
I mean, you're making this argument.
In 2010, we pulled out troops.
I mean, when it happened.
Okay. Like I can list off examples of times we've pulled out troops, but that's not going to change anything. The Parsi evidence looks at one specifically and found that airstrikes and all of these other strikes decreased by 80%.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if that's specifically causal to U.S. troops being pulled out from like.
Yes, it is. It's specific to U.S. troop pullout.
Okay, you can take a question.
Yeah, let's talk about FDI. So at the point where all of your evidence agrees that the FDI that goes into the region is due to like political instability and like oil prices, specifically oil prices is what it says.
FDI comes in for a multitude of reasons. That doesn't mean that the U.S. presence is not one.
I would say that when your evidence explains that the United States presence isn't one, when it talks about the FDI changing, I feel like we should concede to those.
It doesn't say U.S. military presence is not one. What it says is there are a lot of factors, and I agree. In the economy, there are a lot of factors that contribute to investment going up or down. Our argument is military presence is one of those factors. Sure, there are others. It's that simple.
Military presence, why is it the factor that causes a civil war or pushes millions of people into poverty?
No, we say that such a huge paradigm shift, such as the U.S. pulling out of the region entirely, means that investment is not secure in the region, which is why businesses would see a drastic shift down in investment going.
Yeah, we're way over time, but
okay.
Is everyone ready? All right, I'm going to start on our case and then go back to theirs. Let's start on our argument about counterterrorism. What we explained from the Wilson Center is that U.S. forces and Iraqi forces have reclaimed most ISIS territory in the country, cutting terrorism by 75%. They give a couple of responses. First, they talk about splinter groups. The only time splinter groups happen is when the U.S. pulls out of a region. For example, the formation of ISIS happened when the U.S. pulled out. That's when these splinter groups happen. On top of that, they can't even tell you what these splinter groups are. Where are these splinter groups from ISIS forming? So you can't vote on this argument. Then, their second response is that allies are much better. We agree with this. That's why our own argument from Gibbs and Neff says that U.S. troops in Iraq are what allow Iraqi troops to counter terrorism because they give them intelligence and training. Their own evidence talking about how Iraqi forces are crucial to counter-terrorism efforts talks about how they're supported by the coalition that is headed by the United States. U.S. forces are key to allies' counter-terrorism efforts, which means that on net, you are going to need U.S. presence in order to counter terrorism. This is really important because the NOAC evidence says that if the U.S. was to leave the region, there would be an ISIS resurgence that would displace 1.8 million people and create 6 million people who need assistance. This is going to outweigh their argument for a couple of reasons. First, because it is much bigger than any of the impacts that they talk about. Their literal impact is that drone strikes are killing like 2 people per strike. That is not comparable to the millions of people who are displaced by ISIS. But moreover, we would argue that this ISIS resurgence would only worsen the impacts that they talk about, because their own evidence about drone strikes talked about how drone strikes are happening in places like Iraq against ISIS. So that means if you have more terrorism, that increases drone strikes on net. And it's also going to increase things like civil conflicts in places like Yemen, and then that'll just get shifted over to Iraq, which means on that, conflict gets worse, all of their arguments get worse with an ISIS resurgence. With that, let's go to their case. On the argument about drones, realize that UAV, unmanned armed vehicles, can be operated by anywhere. They say that there are still people in bases. But yes, but those people can be in bases in places like Israel or places like the United States. The whole point is you don't need someone on the ground in the Persian Gulf to conduct these airstrikes. But secondly, drone strikes are more targeted, which is why they actually decrease casualties. That's why the Stanton evidence says that on net, drone strikes actually kill less civilians than other airstrikes. But thirdly, their evidence for why airstrikes are happening right now, they say 25,000 airstrikes. half of those are in Syria, which is not the Persian Gulf, and the other half were to combat ISIS, which is no longer a threat, which means on net drone strikes aren't happening in the Persian Gulf anywhere. They have no uniqueness. Finally, on the argument about Yemen, we read you the dual evidence that U.S. military presence is what gives the U.S. leverage to force Saudi Arabia to the table. They say that this hasn't worked. That is not true. We are literally in a ceasefire in Yemen right now, and Warner says that most people predict that the war will literally end because of U.S. presence. But second, remember that the edit tells you that a pullout would only embolden the Houthis. They just say that the Houthis want peace. The reason the Houthis want peace is because they are losing. When you pull out, like what happened in 2017, where the Houthis only got more emboldened and took more land, which is really important because Beaumont finds that the Houthis are starving 16 million people. They're much worse for the war, which means on net the war only gets worse in an affirmative war.
Couple pieces of evidence I would need to see.
What?
First, I need the one that says drones on net kill more people.
Less people.
You can hear me right here. Let me. Drones kill
Yeah,
more people
less
than
people.
that. And
Yeah.
second one, Houthis, 16 million people.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I'll send the first one.
Oh.
We're waiting for the card.
Oh, I don't know why I took away the format. Okay, sorry, it took away the format, but it's like the first line, and then you can look for like the statistics later. And then what was the other one you wanted? Oh, 16 million.
Yeah, that one. Thank you.
Have you gotten the cards? I haven't.
I haven't got the second one yet.
Okay, I sent it, so just tell me when it comes in.
Yeah. I will. Yeah, we're starting prep now. We just got it.
Okay.
How much time do you have left on prep?
Oh, well, now that's it. Okay. You good?
Or how much do you have left?
That's all, prep. Can you hear me? Okay. So the order is going to be our contention 2, and then on to your case. Is everyone good? On our second contention, first let's look at the region, what's going on there right now. They try to tell you there's a ceasefire in the status quo and it's working, so the war is no longer an issue. The issue with that is CNN tells you that the ceasefire that's occurring right now is because of coronavirus. Saudi Arabia said, okay, we're going to try to stop fighting for 2 weeks. Guess what the problem is? The ceasefire has already been broken, and at the point where it was only supposed to last 2 weeks, and we've had hundreds of these ceasefires in the past, and the war is still persisting. I don't think you should place your faith in this one ceasefire that's going to stop the entire war. We need a radical change, which only occurs if you vote for Isaac and I. We tell you from Bando specifically that in the status quo, in their world, United States gives a blank check. We just approve everything Saudi Arabia does, because even if we could potentially use our leverage and tell them to stop, we are not doing so. Whether it's for political reasons or economic reasons is irrelevant. All you know for a fact is right now, there is zero risk of conflict being tangibly resolved. Christoph tells you specifically that if you affirm Saudi Arabia will be scared to lose their security guarantee, which is why they will actually try to mediate the conflict. Parsi gives you the historical analysis here. They tell you that the last time we threatened to pull out the troops, for instance, Parsi looks at 2020, which is very recent. We have seen an 80% decrease in strikes when the United States ended up pulling out some troops and threatening to do it more, which shows to you that Saudi Arabia is willing to negotiate. As for the Houthis, the Parsi evidence also says that in that instance, the Houthis also became more likely to negotiate and started negotiating war. That tangibly confirms our previous argument. We tell you specifically that Houthis just want peace. The escalation happens from the side of Saudi Arabia, and the affirming solves. This is very important. They really just one response in the last speech that says Houthis are bad because 16 million people are dying. The evidence just says the conflict as a whole kills 16 million people. In fact, it's actually 22 million people if you account for the most recent casualties. Thank you for giving us an extra impact to our case. You can already sign your ballot here. That is pretty clean, because if you compare it to any of their impacts, even if you completely give them their entire case, which they go for on terrorism, and you see that 1.8 million people do get displaced and 6 million people do need assistance, on face value, this conflict situation already outweighs their case. But more specifically, we tell you from Security 18 that the situation in Yemen actually breeds more terrorism, which is why if you want to sign your ballot on terrorism, you're going to vote for us, because the kind of tension that they create in their world is much, much worse for the holistic situation. If anything, we tell you from foreign policy that what they do is lead to ideological conflict and further splintering, which is why they can tell you that in Iraq, for example, we've seen a decrease in terrorism, which is not even necessarily because of US. But when you look at the situation globally, when you take a couple steps back and look at the bigger picture, you see from Zenko a 4,000% increase in terrorism due to these actions, which shows you that these groups end up splintering and spreading across the globe, which is why we should let those nations, which already have plenty of intel and plenty of training, handle their problems instead of intervening, creating ideological splintering and exasperating the situation in Yemen, which is why the only way to solve the issues of the status quo are to affirm. Thank you.
Guys, ready for talk?
Yeah.
We'll use the same laptop.
Okay. Ron, you can take the first question if you want.
Great. Are you guys good if we have the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. So you say that the ceasefire has already been broken, right?
Yeah.
But then you also say that the U.S. has not used their leverage at all. Haven't they used their leverage to create this ceasefire?
No, actually, Saudi Arabia just decided that, with like the coronavirus and all, they tried to create a ceasefire, but just like all the previous, hundreds of ceasefires that lasted like a couple days and then.
But you just told me that the only reason that they created the ceasefire was for the coronavirus. But then you also told me that there have been hundreds of ceasefires before this. Doesn't that prove that there are other motives besides the coronavirus that are forcing Saudi Arabia to create ceasefire?
Yeah, but it's not U.S. leverage.
No, but
you literally read evidence that it's specifically U.S. leverage, and you don't respond to it.
We do respond to it. You can see the analysis of the status quo, which in case we tell you that Trump approves their actions, which is why from Bendo, which was extended last speech, we give them a blank check. Like we don't actually stop them from.
Okay.
Okay,
we,
but that's
we understand that, but
Actually trying to stop them. Like, what recent actions have we done that like showed Saudi Arabia that we're not okay with them killing people in Yemen? You tell
by
me.
threatening to withdraw if they continue.
you literally read us a piece of evidence that when the U.S. withdrew, like they partially withdrew troops, that's what led Saudi Arabia
Oh,
to
you're
like
going to
deeply
tell me
strike.
that withdrawing troops is good. Like, maybe the judge should affirm that. I'm confused.
No. It's because the Saudi Arabia U.S. didn't actually pull out their troops; they threatened to. That shows that the leverage is based on the U.S. presence, not on U.S. pulling out.
No,
Let me ask you a question.
Analyzes an actual
Question.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. If the U.S. pulls out all of their troops from Saudi Arabia, how do they have leverage?
Okay, the argument is that Saudi Arabia wants our troops there, right?
Right.
That
Yes,
is
so
where the
if we
leverage
pull out-
comes. We agree
No,
on the
so
fundamental level.
that's not answering our question. Why does the
I
leverage,
will,
where
like,
does
if-
leverage come from in an AF world?
Yeah, give me like a couple seconds. The
Okay.
idea is that we agree fundamentally. Troops is where the leverage comes from. Where we disagree is like how we actually execute that leverage and use it for our advantage. In the status quo, realistically, we're not telling them what to do. If we pull out the troops, Saudi Arabia will want them back, which is why they will try to get our troops back, which is why they will negotiate, they will de-escalate.
Wait, so your solvency is that we're gonna withdraw troops and then put them back, and
No,
that's what's gonna solve the conflict in Yemen.
Saudi Arabia will want the troops back, which is why they will work on these.
Why wouldn't they
Okay,
just
but when they
turn-
realize the troops are not coming back, why would they not just switch back to their original policies?
Yeah, why wouldn't they just turn to another country?
That makes no sense.
Wait, two things. One, the war would already be over by then, hypothetically.
Wait, which piece of evidence says that?
Yeah.
No, our argument is that, but if we pull out
So your assertion is that.
no, the argument that we built up this entire round is that. And
Sure, so which piece of evidence says?
Okay,
That's my
Barbie
question.
says there's an 80% decrease in strikes and escalation.
Well, how is that answering my question?
That's in the status quo. That's without military
That's
withdrawal.
for security guarantee, which is why they will want it back and they will de-escalate.
Wait, also, doesn't the U.S. give them like arms sales?
Like, you can't just suddenly say, oh, like, our case is just like an assertion when I've extended like 5 pieces of evidence.
No, I agree some of this stuff has evidence. I'm just talking about this one specific argument about how the war is going to be over before things happen.
That's time.
Okay. We'll run our remaining prep.
Yeah. Do you guys have can I see the Parsi evidence that when we pulled out the Houthis wanted to negotiate?
Yeah.
I will send that.
Okay, you should get it. How much prep do you guys have? I can't hear you. Hello?
Where does this evidence talk about the Houthis?
Say that again.
Huh?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Where does
Yeah.
that talk about the Houthis?
Oh, here you should. One sec.
Sure.
The part about regional diplomacy. Just read that sentence.
Okay, got it.
It's like at the top. And sorry, how much prep do you guys have?
We had a few left, but I'm just gonna start the speech now.
Okay.
Okay. It'll start on our argument about terrorism, then theirs on the Yemen war. Is anybody not ready? Okay. On our argument about counterterrorism, the Wilson Center evidence says that the United States and Iraqi forces have been working together and reclaimed land previously reclaimed by ISIS. And the Gibbons-Neff evidence indicates that the U.S. aids Iraqi forces through training and resource support. They try to make two responses. First, they read the Zenko evidence saying that globally, terrorism went up 4,000%. It doesn't matter if globally it went up 4,000%. Our argument is just about Iraq, and the resolution is only about the Persian Gulf. Our evidence quantifies that specifically in Iraq, terrorism went down 75% when U.S. troops were there. They next make this argument that we're going to see splintering. We say that sure, even if this splintering happens, empirically it's not bad, as again, we've seen terrorism on a downward trend. Specifically in 2018, it went down 75%. The final argument they make in summary, don't let them make any new ones in final focus, is this argument that local troops can combat them effectively. But the Gibbons-Neff evidence is very specific in saying that the reason that local troops can combat them effectively is because the U.S. aids them. That's why the NOAC evidence, which I encourage you to call for after the round, is super explicit in saying that if the U.S. were to withdraw from the region, that would lead to an ISIS resurgence. Recognize that this is exactly what happened when the U.S. withdrew in 2011. We saw an ISIS resurgence, and we tell you that the impact is 6 million people being put under need of humanitarian aid and 1.8 million displaced. Prefer our argument over theirs on historical precedent, because there is no historical precedent for pullout leading to the Houthis decreasing their fighting. Our Johnson evidence says that the opposite happened. We saw the Houthis increase their fighting. Their Parsi evidence doesn't talk about the Houthis even once. It's incredibly miscut. The Yemen war only gets worse in their world. However, empirically, we tell you that terrorism has decreased. Our argument is backed up in the empirics. But let's go to their argument about Yemen anyways. First, if the U.S. were to pull out, Saudi Arabia wouldn't keep trying to get the U.S. back. They would just turn to other actors. The U.S. would lose their leverage. But second, and more importantly, the huge flaw in their argument is, even if Saudi Arabia stops fighting in their world, the Houthis, who they concede started the conflict, will be more emboldened, which is why the Johnson evidence says empirically that's exactly what happened in 2017. Again, even if they win their whole argument about stopping Saudi Arabia, they don't stop the Houthis. They only embolden them. Their Parsi evidence doesn't mention the Houthis once. Our evidence is way better. Vote neg. Thank you.
Okay. You guys hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, thank you. It's just going to be your case, then our case. Neg af. Yeah. Start at the very top about terrorism. He says to look to history, let's do it. He chooses one country and tries to analyze all of terrorism. But our argument is that if you look at the historical trend over the past 10 years, not just Iraq, we've seen terrorism increase by 4,000% globally. Because just because one terrorist group falls doesn't mean that all of terrorism goes away. Because they splinter up into smaller, decentralized groups that cause a lot more havoc. He just says that local groups can't solve for terrorism on their own because they need intel. But just because you don't have intel doesn't mean you can't take down a few terrorist organizations. Our argument is because the United States is there. Nations are driven by anti-Western sentiments to rally up their terrorist forces, which is why we've seen terrorism increase globally by 40,000%. They don't interact with it at all. Even further, you can vote for us on our case using theirs, because Security 18 explains is that instability through things like wars that we're seeing in the Yemen conflict are what breeds terrorism in the first place. Things like poverty, regional differences, all of these issues are what start terrorism. With that, let's go on our case and explain why we're winning. Go to our second contention about the Yemen conflict. They just say that we're in a ceasefire right now, but realize that there have been a multitude of ceasefires. The only thing that actually changes is when we pull out US troops, two things happen. First, Saudi Arabia doesn't have as much offensives, so they can look towards the peace table first. But secondly, the United States leverage still exists, but we're actually enacting our leverage for the first time in history, which is why empirically, this is the cleanest place to vote, because they say that this has never occurred. But the Farsi evidence, which they drop again, explains that when the US troops pulled out, we saw an 80% drop in violence as all of the nations involved, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Iran, all went to the peace table and were able to discuss the issues without the United States imperialist forces involved. Then they say that the Houthi rebels are only looking for peace because they're losing right now. No, they're not. They were a rebel group that just wanted a part of their land and territory. Once they get that, they will go to the peace table. That's why they've said they want to go to peace. That's why we tell you that 22 million people are on the threat of death if you don't vote for us. That's the largest impact in Iran. If the conflict doesn't end, we're not going to get aid through. Millions will die. And the only place that you can vote right now is Affirm.
Iran.